We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
December 7th, 1941. At 7:55 a.m., an unexpected military strike exploded on the American naval fleet based in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, approximately 2,400 Americans lay dead on American soil. The sense of isolation from the war abroad was shattered and replaced with horror and fear. It was the beginning of World War II for the United States of America. At the time of the strike on Pearl Harbor, 127,000 Japanese Americans lived in the United States, primarily on the West Coast. The reactions to the Empire of Japan's direct attack on the United States quickly led to paranoia and scrutiny of Japanese Americans by both the American public and the government. Accusations of spying for Japan spread, and this paranoia resulted in legislation that revoked the rights of American citizens in the United States based on their ethnicity. Korematsu versus the United States is the Supreme Court case that sought the restoration of those rights, and still demands public discussion on whose responsibility it is to protect civil liberties, and what circumstances might negate those rights. On February 19, 1942, 2 months after the tragedy at Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, allowing military officials to designate any location as a military area where people of any kind could be denied entry. The order's broad language allowed for the evacuation of those excluded to designated areas where they would be provided accommodations. In other words, internment camps. The order did not mention Japanese Americans specifically, but it was ultimately used to exclude those of Japanese descent. Most of the people removed from their homes were loyal American citizens with no ties to Japan other than their ethnic background. Despite this obvious mistreatment of Japanese Americans, few protested or disobeyed the order in an attempt to prove their loyalty to the United States. Fred Korematsu was a 22-year-old American-born citizen when the executive order was signed. He never intended to become an American hero or civil rights symbol when he made the conscious decision to ignore the order to report for exclusion. He was a proud American and claimed no loyalty to Japan, and questioned why he should have to leave his home and be treated like a criminal. Fred assumed a false identity in an attempt to cover his ancestry, but he was eventually arrested on May 30th, 1942, in San Leandro, California. He was put into a federal jail and charged with violating an executive order. Ernest Besiege, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, had been waiting for a case to challenge the constitutionality of internment, and offered for the ACLU to represent Korematsu. Korematsu was held in the Tanforan Assembly Center while his case went to trial, and on September 8, 1942, United States v. Korematsu was heard. Fred denied being a spy and pledged himself to America, but he was found guilty and sent to the Topaz War Relocation Center. On February 19, 1943, exactly 1 year after the executive order was issued, the Korematsu v. United States case went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, ultimately ending up in the Supreme Court, where oral arguments were heard on October 11, 1944. Charles Fahey, the Solicitor General appointed by Roosevelt, argued that internment of the Japanese was a military necessity and would be the most effective preventive measure, despite having read several intelligence reports that denied detection of espionage in the greater Japanese American community. He stated that if Japanese Americans were loyal and wanted to contribute to the war effort, they would accept their internment. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court upheld Korematsu's conviction for violating the executive order. Justice Black wrote that the exclusion was not out of racism or hostility, but because America was at war with Japan. He stated that because, quote, it was impossible to bring about an immediate segregation of the disloyal from the loyal. Exclusion of those of Japanese origin was a military imperative, end quote. And that Congress and the President had legally given the military the power to make that decision. Justices Roberts, Murphy, and Jackson dissented. Justice Roberts wrote in his dissent that the order was a violation of the Constitution, quote, a case of convicting a citizen as a punishment for not submitting to imprisonment in a concentration camp, based on his ancestry and solely because of his ancestry, without evidence or inquiry concerning his loyalty and good disposition towards the United States." End quote. Justice Murphy stated that, quote, "all Americans were connected to a foreign land, entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution." End quote. In 1945, all detainees were released from the camps. Fred Korematsu moved on with his life. His criminal conviction, however, followed him and made it difficult to find work. He felt mistreated by his own government and uneasy because his record in court could be used to support another internment. Peter Irons learned about Korematsu's case while in law school. He found that evidence confirming there was little threat to national security had been withheld from the Supreme Court by government lawyers, and the vast majority of those of Japanese ancestry were indeed law-abiding individuals. On November 10, 1983, Fred Korematsu returned to court on the basis of coram nobis, a fraudulent error that led to Korematsu's conviction. The judge delivered an immediate ruling and vacated his conviction. This did not overturn the Supreme Court decision, but it was a long overdue acknowledgement that the exclusion and internment had been a mistake. In 1998, former President Bill Clinton awarded Mr. Korematsu with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a civilian can receive from the government. He compared Fred Korematsu to Rosa Parks and Homer Plessy, noting that Fred had been an ordinary man who took on the responsibility to fight and ensure the rights of his fellow American citizens. In 2011, Neil Katyal, the acting Solicitor General, confirmed that Fahy had been untruthful and withheld government documents in support of Korematsu's position. He officially apologized and said that internment was an error. Despite the apologies and reparations, it is still possible, though perhaps unlikely, for the Korematsu case to be used as a legal precedent to revoke the rights of Americans and subject them to internment in the future should those in power conclude the circumstances warrant such actions. In a modern era of terrorism, the case has been discussed as a legal argument to support expanding government powers and withholding due process. Current Supreme Court Justice Scalia recently referred to the words of Cicero, "In times of war, the laws fall silent," and said, quote, "That's what was going on. The panic about the war and the invasion of the Pacific and whatnot. That's what happens. It was wrong, but I would not be surprised to see it happen again in a time of war. It's no justification, but it is the reality." End quote. When the laws fall silent in times of war, to whom does the responsibility of giving voice to the constitutional rights of Americans fall, especially when hysteria and fear dominate a nation? Is the law itself enough? The 14th Amendment of the Constitution grants us equal protection under the law, and the 5th Amendment protects us from denial of the rights of life, liberty, and property without due process. Both existed long before Japanese internment. That law and leadership are necessary, but Fred Korematsu reminds us that the responsibility for standing up and speaking for our rights as citizens belongs to each of us.